All right, welcome back to another episode. I'm your host, Mercedes Pallmeyer, and in today's episode, we're going to be talking about nutrition pitfalls that often hold climbers back. And I am joined by a very special guest, Amanda Fit. Hello, Amanda.
Hello, thanks for having
Hi.
me.
Yeah. Actually, this is, I think, our first time on the podcast together. Um, and Amanda is actually our nutrition expert in the Modus training membership. So she comes and talks to the students once every couple months about usually a pretty big nutrition topic. And I would say it's like definitely the most engaging workshops that we tend to have inside of the membership. And I always really appreciate all the topics you bring and the expertise. And I know the members do as well. So yeah, do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, absolutely. So,
Yeah.
I am a clinical nutritionist. I work in my private practice pretty much exclusively with outdoor athletes. So, lots of climbers, lots of multi passionate athletes. So, people who climb and run and bike and hike and all the things. So, it's a really, really fun population to work with. And I specialize in sports performance as well as digestive health. So, I help a lot of people feel better in their workouts, make sure they are fueling appropriately, performing better if that's something that they have a goal for, and kind of troubleshooting some of their health concerns like digestive issues as well. So, yeah, that's what I do, and very excited to be here as well.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, cool. So we're going to dive in to some common pitfalls. We might be doing some podcasts later down the road that'll tackle some other bigger nutritional topics, but this is a great place to start. So when it comes to climbers nutrition, what do you think, number one, what comes to your head when we're talking about some like nutritional pitfalls, some mistakes?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there are many, right, as we will go through, but I would say probably the first and most common thing that I see is not eating enough during your actual climbing sessions. And I don't know if you see this, Mercedes, but I think a lot of people don't eat a lot during their climbing sessions because they just don't feel hungry enough to actually be eating. And so that's definitely something a myth that we can kind of talk about. I think a lot of people also don't feel like they need the additional fuel. Maybe they don't feel like they're working hard enough in their sessions, or maybe that they just don't need the extra calories. Some people feel sluggish when they work out. So I think there's a lot of different reasons why people do it, but this is like definitely the number one mistake that I see happen often.
Yeah. And I would say, I mean, I'm one of those people. I have a really hard time eating in my sessions because one, when I think about eating, actually kind of makes me feel a little nauseous just thinking about eating something. But depending on how long the session is, if I know, okay, I'm going to be doing at least a 2-hour session a day, I will try to plan like a shake that I can easily drink, and that usually is totally fine. So do you have any recommendations on like how long should, I guess based on the length of sessions, like what do you recommend in terms of fueling?
Yeah, great question. So, kind of a great rule of thumb to abide by is if your sessions are going to be longer than 90 minutes, you likely need a mid-session snack. So I know a lot of folks, a lot of my athletes, a lot of myself and friends, especially even indoor climbing sessions. Sometimes we're there for like 2 or 3 hours. We might not be climbing or training the entire time, but it's still a long enough period of time where you do actually need to take in some additional fuel. So 90 minutes is kind of like my golden rule. And it doesn't have to be super complicated, especially if it's an indoor workout where you're at the climbing gym. It could be as simple as just having a snack like halfway through your session, kind of like you were explaining, Mercedes, when you do a 2-hour session, you try to have a shake or something in the middle. And there's a few like tips and tricks that sometimes I like to recommend to help make this feel easier. The first would be set a timer, right? Like if you know you're going to be there for a couple hours, set a timer or alarm on your phone for like 60 minutes and then have that be your literal snack time. I think about like we have a little kids area in our gym, and the kids are always sitting down having a snack halfway through their session. I never see us adults do that. And so we kind of have to treat ourselves like little kids and really remind ourselves to have those snacks and eat. And kind of the second point to that too, and this really ties into if fueling makes you feel heavy or icky or kind of upsets your stomach mid-session, is actually choosing the right type of fuel can make a really big difference for that too.
Mm-hmm. And that's going to depend on the individual and what they can tolerate.
Yeah, definitely some individual tolerance there. I would say a great thing for most people to focus on is simple is better, and especially simple in the carb department. So it's probably not going to feel really good to eat something really fatty or fibrous halfway through your session. Just from a digestion standpoint, it's going to take longer to pass through your GI system. It's going to take longer to actually break down and absorb. And so if you're eating a type of fibrous or fatty food like trail mix, for example, or like, I don't know who would do this, but some people do. If you're bringing like a bunch of hummus and carrots or something to the gym or to the crag, like that is not going to digest and assimilate as easily as like a really simple carbohydrate, something like maybe a dried piece of fruit, like a dried mango or a banana. Those are simple, easier carbs to digest on the gut. So totally take some experimentation, right? Because everyone's a little different, but keeping in mind simpler is better and aim for simple carbs is always a good, safe bet to start when you're trying this on.
Mm. So it sounds like you don't have to worry so much about fat and protein at this point. It is just like get some carbs in because that is your primary fuel source when you're working out anyway. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. You're going to be using that glucose right away to help power your activities and help replenish any glycogen stores that you might be using up or losing. Now, when we're talking about maybe a longer day out, like a 6 or 8 hour cragging day, then we do sometimes have to think about the other macronutrients, right? Because you're just there for so long. But for a session that's 2, 3 hours, I would say, really just focusing on carbs is all you need to think about.
Awesome. So one thing I did want to go back to kind of session length because I think some people might believe, well, I'm at the gym for 2 hours, but I didn't really do very much. Like I'm climbing a little bit, I stop, I talk to people, I climb a little bit, I stop, and they might convince themselves that they don't need to fuel. Can you talk a little bit more about why maybe it doesn't matter how active you are in those 2 hours? I don't know, but talk to kind of the length and why it's important for almost anyone who is engaging in activity for longer than 90 minutes.
Yeah, really good question. And I think there's a couple different ways that we can talk about this. So,
Okay.
for one, just existing as a human being, we burn through energy, right? So, even if you are not like doing a limit boulder every minute on the minute while you're at the gym, like you are still requiring energy and you are still using fuel. And so, just from a general like eating enough perspective, that is one reason to have a snack. Also, again, one thing that I love to educate athletes on is you are going to be in such a better place from a recovery standpoint, from a performance standpoint, even an appetite standpoint later in the day, if you try to not be in a deficit from an energy perspective during and after your sessions. So, what do I mean by that? If you are going into a session, let's say maybe slightly underfueled, and this doesn't need to be on purpose, right? Maybe you just ate light that day. Could be as simple as that. It's not like you were trying to do this. You go in and you go through a 2 hour session, and even if you don't work very hard, you are still using up stored glucose, which is called glycogen. So you're still needing energy to produce the movements, still needing energy to breathe, still needing energy to talk to people and think, all the things. And what happens is if we are not intaking food or energy from an outside source, we have to rely on our internal stores in order to produce the energy we need to make all of those things happen in that time frame. And the consequences of doing that and not taking in energy could be as simple as maybe you just don't recover and bounce back as well that session. Maybe your appetite catches up with you later in the day and all of a sudden you're starving later on, and that always doesn't lead to like really great food choices either for some of us. I know I don't feel good when I don't feel in control over my food. And then if we really wanted to get super extreme with it, if we do that enough, it can actually start to have some pretty negative physical complications as well, from a hormone perspective, from an immune perspective, all the things. So, I know that's kind of an extreme example, but if we can prevent deficits as much as possible, and if it's as simple as having a banana halfway through your session, that is a great strategy to approach long term. I know that was a very long-winded answer, so feel free to ask questions or comment on anything that I just said.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And it's, I did kind of want you to explain a little further about just humans existing and how we do need to fuel. And I think a lot of climbers might be afraid to fuel too much. And, the diet culture and in Western culture kind of makes us trend toward being afraid to eat too much. And this kind of like, I do want to talk a little bit about timing when it comes to like food intake around a session, because one, like I think there are climbers who go into their sessions fasted. So they might have woken up, they're fasting in the morning, maybe they had some coffee, and then they're going into their session. So there's maybe those folks. And then there's the other side of it where we have like, I know that primarily in the membership, we work with very busy professionals and they don't have time to fuel. Like they might be able to like shove lunch between meetings and then they don't think about eating until they get to the gym and they're like, I feel really tired. And that can sabotage their session, or it might even stop them from even doing their session. So I think there's some things that we could easily fix here with proper nutrition. I would be interested to hear your take on fasted training.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a can of worms.
Oh yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Well, if you follow me on Instagram, you would probably know I am not a fan of fasted training. And that is kind of one of my core philosophies is there is truly, in my opinion, no reason to be fasted other than eating might feel like an inconvenience, right? But from a performance standpoint, from a health perspective, there's really no reason to be fasted. So, and I don't know if you want me to go into the details on why I feel that way. I mean, I think we kind of, okay.
Yeah. It could be a shorter version, but definitely
Totally.
I think people would be interested.
Totally. I am going to assume here that some people listening to this might train fasted because they feel there might be some weight loss benefits to it. So I'm just going to kind of clarify that myth first. And that might be a very small population, but I feel like it's worth addressing if you're listening to this. There have been numerous studies out there that show if body composition changes and weight loss is something that you are trying to do, that there is really no difference in people who train fasted versus train fed as it relates to weight loss for people who are trying to pursue that. So I just want to debunk that myth right now, that if that is your intention, it doesn't need to be. So another reason from a, again, general health or performance standpoint, kind of just going back to that recovery piece, right? So if you are, let's use the morning fasted workout example. When you eat dinner, that's the last meal you probably had for the day. Overnight, you are naturally fasting. And what your body is doing is it is relying on stored forms of energy to help keep you alive and well. If you then go into a training session the next morning, you are already going in depleted from just not having the fuel on board already. What that might look like is feeling really crummy, showing up to your session, not being able to hit, I don't know, the correct RPE at the strength, level that you're intending to be potentially. You might feel that later in the day you bonk at 3 or 4 o'clock because, again, it's just very taxing on your system to have to rely on stores or create the energy when it's not coming in through food. So again, that's just like my personal feeling. It doesn't, and going into practical applications here. So it doesn't have to be a ton of food. I just want to clear that up too, especially if you are doing early morning workouts, you can get by and have a ton of benefit from eating something as little as like 30 grams of carbs, which a real life example would be like a piece of fruit or a banana or an applesauce packet. So it doesn't have to be this huge, crazy event. It really can be as simple, and you will get the actual benefits, health-wise, performance-wise, from even just a tiny little bit of fuel.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you
Okay.
agree
Good.
with that or disagree with any of that. I'm curious to hear your thoughts, Mercedes.
Ooh, my thoughts. Absolutely. I think I used to be into fasting. I did it for a while and then saw some pretty not good results from it, mostly from a how do I say it? Like, I don't know if it affected my hormones, but it felt like my thyroid was not doing what it was supposed to be doing, and I got cold pretty quickly, and it was really hard for me to warm up for my sessions. So that was something that happened, and I did fasting over 10 years ago, I think, when it first became like a thing. And another thing that I noticed, and this is really interesting, is that instead of getting more cut, I actually got like my I don't know if my body composition necessarily changed too much, but I did lose weight. But instead of looking more cut, I actually had a layer of fat in front of everything. It's like, this has never happened before. Intermittent fasting, probably not the most ideal thing, especially as a woman. So yeah, like I've definitely like experimented, did not go well, did not like it. Yeah, and I definitely notice if I don't eat enough in the morning for my morning session, my recovery really does lag behind. And I think that is that should be a huge win for people in understanding, if you eat in your session or just before your session, you're already paying dividends for your next training session. So I think that's kind of like the big takeaway I do want people to kind of get out of this. And then recently I just listened to Stacey Sims. She just did a Huberman podcast about just like female hormones. And just like maybe females in general don't respond well to fasting. One, because of the cortisol levels in the morning. And if you're fasting and you're training, that's just like extra cortisone, and carbs help to balance the hormones out in the morning. And she actually mentioned exactly what you did, like 30 grams of carbs. Yeah. So it's like very consistent. I'm curious about protein in the morning though. Like, is that something you would push an athlete to do if they don't have a ton of time and they're like, okay, I got 30 grams of fat. Should they try to get some protein, or they don't really need to worry about it as long as they get enough protein during the day?
Good question. I think it depends on the session. I think it depends on the athlete for sure. And how long the session is going to be as well. So if someone is going into a 45-minute, let's say 45 to 60-minute quick climbing session or quick strength training workout, they might be able to get by, and again, maybe this is really early in the day, with just a small amount of 30 grams of carbs, let's say. And then right afterwards, and when I say right afterwards, we're really being on top of as soon as possible after the workout, that's when maybe our first protein source is coming in for the day. Any workout longer than that, and again, this just might boil down to how much you can tolerate from a food, amount wise in your gut too. It would be great if people could squeeze in a little bit of protein. So I'll give an example. So what 30 grams of carbs would look like with maybe a sprinkle of protein in there could be a slice of toast with a little bit of almond butter and maybe some honey. Bonus point if you could do a couple slices of banana on there. So we're getting a little bit of protein, a few grams from both the piece of toast, if it's like a wheat-based toast, and a nut butter. And you're getting the carbs in, again, from the grain, from the banana, from the honey. So that would be, in my opinion, like a perfect little combination mishmash of a pre-workout fueling example, essentially. I know Stacey Sims is super fond of her little pre-made protein shake in her coffee as she's like on the way to the gym, because it has a little bit of carb, it has a little bit of protein. That's a great option too. So it can look a lot of different ways, but yeah, protein, it's if people are getting enough in at the beginning part of the day, I would rather it happen at some point, not necessarily throughout the whole part of the day, but if that then looks like just right after the session, that's okay too, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, Going back to in-session fueling,
Mhm.
what was your recommendation for how many grams, like kind of minimum?
Yeah, good question. That 30 gram for climbers, if it's an indoor session and if we're not hiking 6 miles to a crag, that 30 grams is more than enough for most folks. Again, there's nothing wrong with eating more. If you want to go 45, if you want to go 60, hell yeah, get the benefits of more carbs and feel good from it. But just at a minimum, general rule for most people, kind of that 30 grams is a great rule of thumb. And if people are curious about what that even looks like in real life, if it's a packaged item, just flip that item around, look at the nutrition label, and see in total carbs how many grams of carbs are being provided by that particular food. If it's a whole food option, you can always, there's so many databases, so many food tracking apps that you could just quickly search like one banana and like see how many grams of carbs are in that, just to bridge the gap between that number and what that actually looks like in real life.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And then lastly, I don't know if you have any tips for your busy professionals who do their sessions at night and tend to have basically like 5 hours of not eating before their session. And I think this is what I see the most. This is the most common thing that I see. They're done with work, they're feeling really tired. They start their session, they're like, I feel like poop. Like, do you have any strategies for folks like that who might forget to eat? Like anything that can help them remind, like, hey, did you eat before this session?
Yeah, the reminders are hard. And I think everyone is different, right? With like, some people resonate with setting an alarm or a calendar reminder, where other people would be like, I'm going to snooze that and forget about it, So I think finding a strategy that works well for you just from the reminder standpoint is great. From a like practical standpoint, I'm a huge fan of leaving some emergency food items in like a gym bag. So again, if you happen to forget, you're able to grab that quick bar from your bag when you start your session and realize, wow, why do I feel like dog poop? And it's like, oh yeah, I didn't eat. Well, I have a bar available that I could quickly kind of squeeze in. For evening sessions, like people who are working, a 9 to 5 and then do a later climbing session in the evening, I'm a super big fan of like the 2-part dinner. I don't know if you've ever heard of this or tried this. Just take your dinner, take what you would normally have, and literally just divvy it up in half. So this might require a little bit of prep ahead of time, right? A little bit of preparedness. But if you just have half of the portion, an hour, 30 minutes before your session, and save the second half of your dinner for right afterwards, that tends to work really well for people. So you're not eating a ton of food at like 9 o'clock at night, but you're still fueling after your long workday and then going into your session with some stuff in the tank, basically. So that I find works well for some people too.
Hell yeah. Okay. Last question around this. Does it matter how close to the session? Oh, here's maybe a better way of phrasing it. How quickly do you think the carbs can really kick in to help someone kind of overcome that sluggish feeling? Because I get this question a lot. They're like, well, how soon should I be eating before my session is like right when I start too late?
Great question. Yeah, it's such a great question. So, from a general, like how quickly we can absorb things, it does take a little bit of time, but it also depends on the composition of the meal or of the snack. So if it's like a really simple carb, like a sugar, I'm thinking of like my little honey stinger gummies that I love for like a quick hit when I need sugar. That is going to be absorbed a lot quicker than if you're eating, say, a rice bowl in like a mixed meal with protein and, even the rice itself, because it's a little bit more complex. So at a minimum, and I'm going to say this with a caveat, before your session, if you haven't had a meal in like 2 hours, it's good to have a carb rich snack about 30 minutes before, because 30 minutes will allow just enough time for you to actually absorb those carbs and have them start to enter your bloodstream, and then they'll be available for use, essentially. I say that though, not to deter people where like, well, I didn't have a snack 30 minutes before, so I shouldn't have anything at all. Still have the thing because you will be absorbing it and you will be utilizing it. So don't let that deter you. But that 30-minute before your session time frame works really, really well for getting it in to your bloodstream and being able to use it.
Okay, awesome. I just thought of another question. So if we're training for 90 minutes, 2 hours, should we be taking a bite of a banana every 20 minutes or 30 minutes to like get that sustained energy throughout the session? Or is it like, oh, it's been 60 minutes, I should eat something? Like, do you know if there's like an optimal way of fueling during your session?
Good question. And this kind of relates to, how fueling for climbing might differ a little bit from other sports. Let's say like an endurance-based sports, like cycling or something like that. We have a lot more flexibility as climbers with how we fuel and the timing that we intake that fuel mid-session. So some people prefer, as what you're describing and what I call the microdose approach, where you're kind of having a small little bit every 15 or 20 minutes. That can actually be a really great strategy for folks with GI issues, or not even GI issues, but where fueling might irritate your belly and might feel like it sits a little heavy. So I love the small, more frequent bites approach for those types of people. But really from like a performance benefit or anything like that. Again, as climbers, we have the flexibility to eat every hour on the hour if we wanted to as well. That still is enough time to be getting in the fuel at an appropriate interval and not let it go too long in between snacks and fuel. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yep. So about every hour for
Yes.
climbers, that might be good enough to fuel. Okay.
If you go longer than that, then we can get a little sticky. But that's a good rule of thumb. Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know if your clients will kind of maybe describe how they're feeling as the session goes on and like how their energy is going. Because a lot of the time, here's what I hear, Amanda. They text me, they're like, man, the session, it started off really well. And then it just like, it felt like I regressed in the session. I'm not getting any stronger. And then usually the first question is, did you eat? So do you have like common symptoms that people can kind of like look out for during the session that could indicate this is probably a nutritional issue?
Yes, I love this. Yeah. I would say the number one thing to look out for is kind of as you're describing what I call a bonk or like a regression mid-session or kind of towards the end of your session. And I would say this normally happens when it's fueling related, probably at about like the 45 to hour mark, kind of depending on what you're doing up until that point. Up until that point, you can get by with kind of running on low, essentially, like if your gas light was on. But after that, you're going to start to notice the physiological consequences of being underfueled. So, and what I describe bonking to look and feel like is like a powering down. Like you get on a boulder and you're like trying to throw a move and you're like, what the heck? Like I just cannot make it happen. It's almost like you just can't generate that power or the energy that you need to do it in a way that you can do. Or even like when I start to feel like I just can't hold on to the wall anymore. But again, I haven't even been climbing that long. It's kind of that quick to fatigue sensation. Do you use RPE with a lot of your athletes, Mercedes?
Yeah.
So I also describe it as for the level of intensity of the session or the problem that you're doing. If your RPE, rate of perceived exertion, is like way higher than it should be, that's also a good indicator too that like, hey, maybe there was some opportunities for fueling that I missed as well. Trying to think of some other things that I commonly hear. Brain fog too, like grumpiness. I think we're all familiar with the sensation of being hangry. It might not be super overt from a performance standpoint, but that's also a really great indicator that maybe we needed to fuel a little bit better.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. I think we have actually a lot to talk about just on this one topic. So yeah, thank you for going down that little rabbit hole. We have a couple other questions here. Ooh, can we talk about one of the common setbacks or pitfalls for climbers would be maybe a fear of carbs, and how it impacts performance, and maybe just riff on that a little bit. And I have some follow-up questions.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think just as a society, carbs are demonized, right? I mean, I think, we've all seen the diets that demonize carbs and all the things. And rightfully so. As you had mentioned, a lot of the athletes that I work with too are like real life human beings who have real jobs and are doing these sports as, a recreational fun activity. And a lot of these folks still have general health concerns too, right? Like we all do. So I get where this fear is coming from. I think a lot of it is stemmed from, I'm scared if I eat too many carbs, I'm going to gain weight. I'm going to gain fat. I think that's a huge, huge common thing that people experience. There is so much nuance. That's what I really want people to know. There's so much nuance when it comes to carbohydrates, and everyone is going to be different in terms of how much they can tolerate and when. But we actually have so much flexibility when it comes to timing the carbs right, what types of carbs that you're having, to still be able to get the benefits of carbs while still negating any possible negative side effect, let's say, of consuming carbs. So I just share that and just riff off of that because it's not as easy as carbs or no carbs. There's a lot that can go into it that still allows you to eat them in a way that supports you and your health and your goals.
Mm-hmm. I do wonder because the number, I don't know, maybe it's the second reason why people like die earlier, like a chronic disease, would be obesity in this country. And I think a lot of the messages that we're getting seems to stem from like, if you eat too much sugar, your path is obviously going to go down that, that road. And sure, like there's like insulin resistance, like that happens, metabolic syndrome. And that doesn't, maybe you've had clients like this, but I haven't had a client where obesity is the problem and we really need to help them kind of like on a maybe more of a medical level. I work with people who are very active and who want to feel really good. And so carbohydrates really needs to be at the forefront of what they're eating. I don't know, like in terms of like culture, I'm curious to hear some of your thoughts on that, and like how worried should we be with insulin resistance? Is that actually a thing?
Great question. Yeah. I mean, yes, it's absolutely a thing, but worry, right? So I think we need to always get really clear on, I think we worry and fear a lot in nutrition, right? And the priorities and sometimes the stress and the worrying of our food choices is almost worse for our health than the food choices themselves. But I'll just kind of back up a little bit. So I've worked with tons of athletes who actually have very valid metabolic concerns. They might actually have PCOS and insulin resistance. They have a family history of diabetes. Maybe they are pre-diabetic themselves. And again, the answer is so much more nuanced than carbs are evil, because carbs did not create that situation to begin with. They're multi-factorial complex conditions that lead to the things that we're talking about. And so long story short is we don't have to fear carbs. We just have to know how to consume them intelligently in a way that is going to be supportive of our bodies. And for 99.9% of the people that I work with, the answer is never to cut them out. Ever. I'm always telling people to eat more carbs, and we're doing so in a way that's really curated towards them. There's something else that I want to say about that too, that I'm just totally blanking, but maybe it'll come back to me. I don't know if me talking through that sparked anything for you, Mercedes. But
well, what I'm thinking about is how the body uses energy. Yes. And athletes will use carbohydrates or glucose in the blood primarily when they're moving. But there is some distribution of fat stores that we use. But somehow I think that, especially with the keto diet and intermittent fasting, like that, the using your fat stores as energy is really the key to performing well. And we know that that is just like for climbers, especially boulder sport climbers, we rely so much on being very powerful, very dynamic over and over and over again. Like we're not moving very slowly for a very long amount of time. Like maybe that would be more fat. You would use more fat storage for that, as opposed to 2 hours of sport climbing. That's mostly going to be carbohydrates and some fat storage. So, like to me, I think we have to be very clear on that. I think
100%. I mean, it boils down to energy systems, right? Each different type of activity that you're doing, even different types of movements that you're doing, even within a single activity, is going to require different fuel sources. And the way that climbers move their body, we are predominantly using glucose, which comes from carbohydrates, as fuel. And again, just to highlight, I remember what I was going to say, to kind of squash some of the fear that's around carbs too, is when we are moving our body, the way that we are taking glucose from the blood and bringing it into our cells to use for energy, that actually doesn't require insulin. We do require insulin when we are at rest, but when we are moving, there's a different mechanism of uptake. So again, kind of squashing, even if you do have type 2 diabetes, even if you are insulin resistant, there are still ways that you can consume carbs that are still going to be supportive of your condition. But again, that aside, yes, the type of movement that we do for climbing, we need carbs. End of day, we need carbs.
Yeah. Awesome. I would like to know about what kind of simple carbs, because I actually really like M&Ms. That is a thing that I look forward to. I will eat some M&Ms. But I think what I've noticed is that if I rely too much on that type of fuel source, like just sugar, basically, that I tend to get a little bit hypoglycemic, or I get like the shakes. So I'm curious if you could maybe talk a little bit about that, and how, like, when can we eat some like very simple sugars, like if I want to eat some M&Ms or some gummy bears, and is there a point where, or is there an amount that I maybe shouldn't be eating so that I can make sure I don't hit that weird hypoglycemic feeling?
And just out of curiosity, do you hit that kind of like crash hypoglycemic feeling after M&Ms for longer sessions? Or I'm curious, a little context on that, because I might be able to better answer this question.
It's been a really long time since that has happened. Okay. I think it's mostly when I notice this if I have breakfast and it might be more fat focused, like, oh, I had some bacon, I had eggs, and I didn't maybe eat a ton of carbs, and then later I like had some sugar, maybe I had a croissant with like a chocolate croissant, and then I go into my training session and I eat something sugary. Now, like, it feels like my energy is like, ooh.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. And I'm just gonna, like, this is such an it depends question, so yes. I'm just gonna start with that. But because right, it might depend on, what does the context of the entire day look like, and then how is that simple sugar then interacting with your body given everything else that you've eaten that day. So I totally, that's why I was just curious to hear a little bit more. Totally. But so kind of going back to the original question, those quick hits, right? The super, super simple sugars, like the candies, like the gummies that I love. Those are, again, we got to think about them as quick carbs. You are going to use them and you are going to burn through them very quickly. And so if we are relying only on those quick, simple carbs for longer activities, right? Or longer durations of things, we might start to notice that we have a lot of highs and then lows, highs and then lows. So I always love to bring a mixed bag of fuel. with me. And so what this means is have some quick, simple carbs with you, but also have some slow, maybe more mixed carbs as well. So I'll give an example. Let's say if you want to bring like some candy with you, some Swedish fish or something like that. I might also bring a Go Macro bar with me that's also still very high in carbs, but it does have a little bit of protein in there and a little bit of fat, which makes it slower overall. So I guess the context of what I'm describing here is length of time matters, length of session, how often you're moving and grooving throughout that session too. Because if you're having a simple carb, you do a couple boulder problems and then you sit there, you might start to feel a little bonky hypoglycemic in a way too. So moral of the story is bring mixed items. And if you're going to be out there longer, you need to have a mix of slow carbs and simple carbs. And that's even where we start to come into maybe a little bit of protein in the discussion too for those longer sessions. Yeah. Nuanced answer.
Yeah. And it kind of does seem like if you do experience some hypoglycemia in a session, that it might not necessarily be what you're eating in that session. It could have been everything else that you ate during the day. Yeah.
Yes. 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Cool. I'm looking at my questions here. Mm-hmm. We have not a lot of time.
We could probably do one more. We could do a quick. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if this is quick. Maybe I feel like this is a problem is hydration. Most people are not hydrated. Can you speak to that? And that'll be our last little thing.
Yes, 100%. We talk about food, we talk about carbs, but hydration matters too. And what I really love to emphasize for athletes and hydration is having a good, reliable electrolyte to lean on when you need it. And what are electrolytes? They're just minerals. And so the fluid balance in our body not only relies on just water, but actually things like sodium and potassium to really help the balance of hydration happen in our body. And as athletes, we actually burn through minerals really quickly, not only when we are actually sweating, if it's a really hot day and you're in the gym or you're outside and you're physically sweating, but also just generally we burn through a lot of minerals, even things like potassium and magnesium at just a higher rate than your average Joe as people who move our bodies. So I love to suggest like a really good high quality electrolyte for most of my athletes out there. And this could be a daily thing for some people. This could be just on the days that you are training. But that's like my big take home message for hydration is yes, water matters. And we need a little extra something in there too, a lot of the times.
Okay. Do you have any like recommendations for how much water? I mean, like it seems like it's generally between 2 and 3 liters and how big your body is, how much you're actually sweating. But I think some people don't even think about drinking water in the morning. This is something like I yell at my wife every morning. I'm like, don't forget to drink your water because she doesn't remember. But it seems like spreading it out through the day is maybe better than just having like 2 times in the day. You're like, oh, I haven't drank any water. Do you have any tips or recommendations around that?
Yes, you are absolutely right in terms of spreading it out throughout the day is so much more ideal than forgetting, and then pounding a bunch of water from like 6 to 8 o'clock at night. And, you know, the general rule of thumb is about half of your body weight in ounces is kind of the hydration goal. You know, I would say a good target for a lot of people is like 60 to 80 ounces per day. If you're drinking more than that, then minerals and electrolytes become even more important actually, because you can actually dilute them if we're drinking too much water. That's actually a real thing, but timing is huge. So yeah, if you can, you know, waking up, having an 8 to 10 ounce glass of water before you get down on your coffee or tea is always just a great way to start. And then sometimes that keeps the ball rolling too. So yeah. I know it's easy to forget about water and hydration.
Yes. Yeah. And I think a lot of people don't like to drink water because maybe it just doesn't taste good to them. But this electrolyte might actually make it more palatable. And I used to do a little bit of sea salt with like a squeeze of lemon or lime. Like, is that good enough for some people, or should they get, if they're considering an electrolyte, should it be like something you can buy from the store?
Great question. That is pretty darn good for most people. One thing though is sodium, so what we get from table salt, and potassium actually work synergistically to one another. So some folks, if we have too much sodium without kind of the right balance of potassium, that can cause a little bit of an imbalance. And again, sea salt is great, but we're just mainly getting sodium from that too. So as like an everyday electrolyte, doing a little bit of sea salt, salting your food, doing a little citrus or something in there is great. As we start to train more, get outside, and are really kind of moving our body more, I do recommend, and it can be a DIY thing too, but getting that appropriate sodium to potassium ratio, whether it be in a pre-made product electrolyte mix that you buy, or you can make it yourself in some situations too. But yeah, good question.
Oh man, I have like 10 questions related to all of that you just but I'll keep it. I think I'm just gonna ask maybe one more. And what was it? Oh my god. So hydration is also a common, I'm gonna say, enemy of, like, if you're not hydrated enough, you're not gonna have enough energy at the gym either. This is something I see quite often in myself. So what are some maybe signs or symptoms that someone might experience during the session that might indicate, hey, you should probably drink a little bit more water right now?
Yeah. I would say headache, fatigue, lethargy, right? Not necessarily like a powering down that we would experience from a lack of food fuel, but just feeling tired and a little like under the weather in a way, I think is a big sign of low hydration and needing to be more hydrated. And also nausea, believe it or not. That's actually a huge symptom that I see when people are underhydrated, is they feel sick to their stomach. And again, it sounds so counterintuitive to then want to put more in, but that's definitely something to keep on your radar for hydration too.
Yeah. Dehydration, really, it actually kind of scares me. Like I was on a college tennis team, and one of my teammates, he played like a 3-hour session, and it was pretty hot, and he was hydrating and he was drinking Gatorade. He was done with the match, and we were just sitting and chatting, and all of a sudden he just like went into shock. And like he was shaking, he just got white, like we couldn't communicate with him. And then when the paramedics came, they're like, oh, he's dehydrated. I was like, oh my God, like this, like dehydration is actually very dangerous, especially for folks who are going outside for a long time and heat and altitude. And, like I think most of us don't really need to worry about it for our gym sessions, but hydration is something that we can easily forget about, but it has high consequences, So keep drinking that water, folks.
Drink that water. Drink that water. Get an electrolyte. Don't it's hard to make up hydration too, right? Like once you're already dipping into that dehydration point, like it really is hard to get out of it. So just another reminder to stay on top of it.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite electrolyte that you buy?
Yeah, there's a few different ones that I like, and they all have different compositions. For people who want more of like a water flavoring one, or like an everyday lower sodium electrolyte, I love Ultima. That's safe for like most people. It's like very low sodium. When we start to go outside, sweat more, I really like the Relight brand. It's made with like, I don't know if people are familiar with the Redmond's sea salt, but it's their company. That's a really nice one too. I also really like Zero Light. That's a good one. There's so many different ones out there, but those are my top 3 that I go to.
Yeah. Great. All right, Amanda, I have kept you long enough. Thank you so much for hopping on with me, and we'll definitely do this again. That was awesome.
Yeah. Thank you. I know we'll do some deep dives rather than the high level.
Sounds great. All right. Thanks, Amanda. And we'll catch everybody in the next one. Bye.